Okay, the last two concepts that are related to stakeholder theory that I want to share with you are the triple bottom line and corporate social responsibility, or CSR. So let's look at CSR first. Corporate social responsibility has two meanings. First, it's sort of a general idea or general name for a company that emphasizes both the responsibility to make money and the responsibility to interact ethically with the surrounding community. The second meaning is corporate social responsibility is also a specific conception of that responsibility to profit while playing a role in a broader question of community welfare. So we're not talking about it either or, we're talking about and. So we're talking about profit and being responsible outside the corporate walls. I want to share 4 obligations with you that have to do with corporate social responsibility and obligations that companies have. Obviously, there's the economic responsibility to make money. So this is basically simple economics, right? This obligation the business has to, it's kind of like human survival. If a company doesn't make profit, it dies. So, especially in our modern market, capitalistic market that's so international now, if they're not making a profit, they're doomed to perish. Of course, there are special cases like nonprofits and organizations like that, but those organizations pour that money back into their organization. So there's still this idea that they still have to make money. It's just what they do with that money is different than in a for-profit organization. But for the vast majority of companies, there have to be a profit. Without them, there's no business. The second obligation is what we might call the legal responsibility. And that's the legal responsibility to adhere, for a company to adhere to rules, regulations, laws, things like that. But these laws aren't boundaries that enterprises can skirt and sort of cross over if the penalty's low. Instead, responsible organizations accept those rules, not as just a rule, but as a social good. And they make good faith effort to obey not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law as well. In concrete terms, this is a difference between, say, a driver who stays under the speed limit because he can't afford a speeding ticket, and then one who obeys because society as a whole is served when we all agree to respect those signs and stoplights and those rules and those limitations. So you see the difference there. The same goes for a toxic chemical company, and I'll use W.R. Grace, and you can Google them. They neither obeyed regulations or laws until the fine got so high that they had no choice. As against that model of behavior, a CSR, corporate social responsibility vision of business, affirms that society's limits should be carefully obeyed, even if the fine is only a few dollars. So the fine really doesn't have anything to do with it. So now we get into what the third obligation, and that's an ethical responsibility. So we've talked about financial responsibility, legal responsibility. Now let's think about the corporation's ethical responsibility. And this is just to do what's right, even when it's not required by the law. This is the theory's keystone. This is sort of the underlying core idea behind corporate social responsibility. It depends on a sort of a coherent corporate culture that views that business as a citizen inside society, the kind of obligation that citizenship, like we have, normally entails. So if somebody's racing their car along a country road, it's freezing at night, and they see another driver stopped on the roadside with a flat, we have this sort of social obligation to do something. Not everybody, but most of us do. I mean, it's not a legal one, is it? There's no rule or regulation that says you have to stop. So that same logic can be applied in the corporate world. Many industrial plants produce, as an unavoidable part of what they're doing, the processes, they produce poisonous, toxic waste. Again, W.R. Grace was a company in Massachusetts, did a lot of that, as well as a company called Beatrice Foods. And I'm going to give you those. You can look them up and Google and actually read the cases that these companies went through. The law governing toxic waste disposal was at that time sort of ambiguous. So the companies weren't legally required to enclose that poison in what turned out to be then finally rules that said it had to be double encased. So and they had to be leak proof. So that wasn't just a good idea, it was the right thing to do to ensure that contamination would be safely contained. It might not be the right thing to do in terms of pure profit, but from a perspective that values everybody's welfare, including the ecosystem as valuable, the measure makes sense. W.R. Grace did not do that. They actually dumped the waste in 55-gallon drums and dumped them into rivers and dug holes and buried them so that the 55-gallon drums rusted, and all that leaked out and got into the water table. And that was what was called Love Canal. And again, you can look up Love Canal. It was one of the country's worst environmental accidents. So we've talked about economic responsibility, we've talked about legal responsibility, we've talked about ethical responsibility, and the fourth one is called philanthropic responsibility. And here is where a corporation or a company does something for society when they don't have to, when it really has nothing to do with what they do, but they take on, for example, a cause. A law firm, for example. I'm familiar with a couple law firms that once a year they set aside a full day and they invite school kids in so that the kids can see what an attorney does. And they lose that day of productivity, but they do that because they feel it's the right thing to do. It's a philanthropic responsibility. So these acts don't arise from the obligation that extends from the day-to-day operation of that organization. It's not like the responsibility that a chemical firm has for safe disposal of waste, but these are public acts of generosity that represent the view that that business, like everyone, has an obligation to support the general welfare in ways that are determined by the needs of that surrounding community. So that's just in a nutshell what corporate social responsibility is and the four obligations that companies have if they want to be sort of under the rubric of being called socially responsive or socially responsible. So the last stakeholder idea I want to share with you is called the triple bottom line. It's a form of corporate social responsibility, but it encourages actual measurement of what a company does, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of the social realm. When we've talked about the idea of society and organizations having a responsibility to society, and also with respect to the environment. So each of these three should be measured and looked at in terms of sustainability over a period of time. Now, I told you we talk about sustainability, so let's look at that. What does that really mean? What is sustainability? Well, what sustainability means is long-term maintenance of balance of those three measurements. So it's not just economic, it's not just social, it's not just environmental, that there's a balance between those three during the course of whatever that company does. First is economic responsibility. This values long-term financial health over short-term profit. When the company W.R. Grace dumped toxins to the ground, it's true, they were able to increase their bottom line, and they did, but it was only in the short term. Money was saved on disposal costs, obviously, but there's an economic sustainability argument against that kind of bad act. Corporations trying to sort of get away with polluting the environment to save money in the short term almost always find out later on, as Grace did, that there's a risk that later discovery of the action could lead to catastrophic economic consequences. And in 2014, Grace paid EPA $54 million in fines. So this possibility leads immediately to the conclusion that concern for corporate sustainability in financial terms argues against the dumping of waste in the short term. So you see how that economic sustainability means over a long period of time, not just looking at short-term profit. The second idea of the triple bottom line is social sustainability, where we balance people's lives in the way we live, and that is actually measured by the company. A world in which a very few Fortune 500 executives are bringing down millions, in some cases billions of dollars a year, while millions of people throughout the world live on pennies a day, can't go on forever. That is not sustainable. As that imbalance grows, as the rich get richer and the poor get both poor and more numerous, I might add, the chances that society itself will collapse in anger and revolution increase. Now, I know you're saying threat of governmental overthrow and all that from below sounds remote and maybe even ridiculous to us, Americans, who are accustomed to a solid middle class and minimal resentment of the wealthy, but in world history, these revolutions are actually quite common. That doesn't mean revolutions coming to our time, to our developed nation, but it may indicate that for a business to be stable over that long period of time, opportunities and wealth need to be spread out to cover as many people as possible. And one example that I'm familiar with is Merck, big pharmaceutical company. Several years ago, made it a corporate goal to do away with river blindness in Africa. And this was a terrible disease that affected mainly children. They were drinking water that was contaminated, and it was causing them to go blind. And over a 10-year period of time, Merck spent millions and millions of dollars out of their profit, and they did away with river blindness in several countries in Africa. So that's just an example of a company that decided, we can do this. We have the skills, we have the talent, and we have the passion, because we feel it's the right thing to do for people that are suffering. This idea of a fair trade movement that I mentioned before, this is an ethical imperative that it states that opportunity and wealth can be shared. It started basically in the 1960s, where organizations that promoted fair trade, what they asked businesses is this, that they guarantee that suppliers in poor countries receive a reasonable pay for their goods and services, even when the raw economic law of supply and demand doesn't require it. In other words, a company pays a little more for a farmer in Ecuador, for example, who's growing coffee beans. They pay them a little bit more so that company or that family can be sustainable over a period of time, so that company is getting, high quality product over a period of time. So there really is an economic issue here. You're actually building a relationship with somebody in a poor country, so that you just don't look at low bid all the time. You're actually building a partnership. And so this whole idea, when you go in places like Starbucks, for example, you'll see on some of their coffees, it'll have this sticker, it'll say fair trade. So there is an ethical argument. It's that things like peace and order in the world depends on the world's resources, and so that they're sort of divided up in ways that limit things like envy and resentment and anger, because this person or this organization has more than this one does. And it's especially true in the third world. Social sustainability is not limited to economics. So we're talking here a lot about human respect, human dignity. All work should contain dignity. No workers deserve to be treated like machines or as expendable tools on a production line. In today's capitalism, but we do see this, a world in which dignity has been stripped from a large number of trades and professions. Companies see minimum wage workers who will be fired as soon as the economy goes in a downturn. They see bosses hiring from temporary agencies where they never even know who their employees are, not even bothering to learn their names. It's certainly possible that these kinds of attitudes, this sort of contempt, visible in so many workplaces, where I'll call the sort of Mac job reigns, it's not sustainable over a period of time. It can't continue. Just as people won't stand for pennies in wages while their bosses are getting millions, they too ultimately will refuse to accept being poorly treated and less than dignified. And the last stool, the three-legged stool of triple bottom line, is environmental sustainability. This idea begins with the fact that natural resources, especially oil, carbon-based fuels, the clean air we breathe, and the water we drink are limited. These are limited resources. And if these things deteriorate significantly, our children, our children's children won't be able to enjoy the same quality of life that most of us experience. This is sustainability, that we can sustain our environment over a long, long period of time. Things like conservation of resources becomes tremendously important. The development of new sources of energy, we're hearing a lot about that today, that those can be substituted for limited resources. Sustainability, finally, on this environmental front means actions must be taken to facilitate our natural world and its renewal over a period of time. Recycling, cleaning up contamination that already exists is important, as is limiting pollution emitted from factories and our cars and things like that. But all these actions are actions that companies and organizations must support, not because they're legally required to do so or they're economically required to do so, but because the preservation of sort of the planet is a direct obligation within the triple bottom line model of business responsibility. And I'll leave you with this statement. Together, these three notions of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental, guide businesses toward actions that support the company as a participating and good citizen in the community and not just a heartless money machine.